All right, everybody, thanks for returning promptly at 11. We will continue our discussion, this time with Stephen Redding, who will be talking about international trade in an uncertain world. Same approach as before, up to 30 minutes for Stephen, and then we'll have an open discussion.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for the invitation to present here. This is a joint paper with Benny Kleiman, who's also here, over in the back there, Ernest Liu, and David Zhu. And so sort of continuing with some of the themes that Matteo introduced in the first session this morning. So as you all know, the growing concerns about uncertainty and the resilience of the global economy to shocks. So transportation disruptions in the aftermath of COVID-19, uncertainty over national, regional, and multilateral trade policies, very timely given today's AIPA announcement this morning, national security concerns about access to critical goods, and rising geopolitical tensions between China and the United States, and also with the Russia-Ukraine war. But if you sort of think about the sort of standard set of quantitative trade models that we have to think about those questions, it's often quite difficult to address those issues of uncertainty and resilience to shocks within those standard quantitative trade models. In particular, those models are very rich. They allow for hundreds of countries around the world that can be different from one another in terms of their productivities, in terms of their trade costs with one another. So they're very sort of complex, complicated models. And so in order to be able to solve them, we typically make the assumption that when countries decide who to source their goods from, they know with certainty all of the parameters of the model. So they know with certainty what the trade costs are, what the productivities are, and we kind of abstract from these issues of uncertainty and resilience that are obviously so critical to the policy debate. Furthermore, many of these shocks that are uncertain, such as, for example, China invading Taiwan, are shocks that are likely to have general equilibrium consequences. They're not just sort of isolated shocks that will affect individual firms, they'll affect entire countries, they'll affect relative prices, relative wages, real exchange rates around the world. And they're often quite hard to insure against with standard financial instruments. And so what we're sort of really motivated in this paper is to try to bring in this general equilibrium uncertainty in an aggregate, in a quantitative trade model. There are these risks that individuals are thinking about when they make their sourcing decisions. They're hard to insure against, and they're going to affect the entire macroeconomy. And so we really need to sort of think about their large-scale aggregate economic consequences. And so what we're going to try to do is try to develop a tractable framework of bringing in this general equilibrium uncertainty into a sort of very familiar class of quantitative trade models, the so-called class of models with a constant elasticity. Those are usually solved when agents know all of these aggregate variables, and we want to bring in general equilibrium uncertainty and see how that affects the conclusions of these frameworks. When we bring in that aggregate uncertainty, we want to allow countries to make upfront investments in resilience in the face of that uncertainty. Obviously, that's also a key part of the policy debate, given that we know there are these risks. China might invade Taiwan. What can the US do? What can other countries do to try to hedge those risks, to try to build some resilience into the trading network? And so what's going to come out of this framework? Well, we're going to be building on many ideas from finance. We're going to sort of show that once you incorporate this general equilibrium uncertainty into these trade models, then when countries decide who to source their goods from, they not only care about expected relative costs, which is the standard view in this traditional class of quantitative trade models, but they're also going to be thinking about a mean variance problem. They're going to be thinking about a standard portfolio problem. I care not just about expected costs, but I care about the variance of costs. I care about the costs of each supplier, how they're correlated with my own costs, and the costs with all my other suppliers. And so that's going to be sort of one of the key punchlines that comes out, that we need to think about international trade as a portfolio problem. And we'll show you some sort of quantitative illustrations as to how that affects our understanding of patterns of trade. And obviously, we're sort of building on a big literature here in international trade, other areas of economics and political science, and the work on geoeconomics Matteo introduced in the first session today. Cool. So in terms of the structure of the talk, I'll try to outline how we're thinking about modeling general equilibrium uncertainty and resilience, how we handle that technically. Then I'll introduce you to our data, and then I'll kind of showcase what we can do with this framework and how this sort of idea of international trade as a portfolio problem, the sort of new insights that it brings to the table. So we're going to think about each country as having a representative agent that has some endowment of labor that they use to produce goods. That representative agent is risk averse. And so that's why this general equilibrium uncertainty is going to matter. And when countries trade with one another, the reason they trade are countries' goods are differentiated from one another. That's the sort of standard model in international trade. You can actually microfound it in a variety of ways. Everything I say today will hold throughout that entire class of microfoundations, throughout the entire class of quantitative trade models with a constant trade elasticity. So when countries trade with one another, they face some exogenous bilateral trade costs. That's going to be the tau ni. So in order for one unit to arrive in the destination country N, the exporter I has to ship more than one unit because some of the good melts in transit. That's how we think about those transport costs of shipping goods between countries. So one of the new elements in this model is that when countries trade with one another, there are not only those exogenous components of trade costs that I've called the tau, but the bilateral trade costs also depend upon some endogenous investments that countries make. So on the import side, the importing country is going to invest in import capacity. So think about that as investing in transportation networks, logistics, relationship-specific investments with individual exporters. And then the same thing on the exporter side. In order to trade with other countries, the exporter has to make some upfront ex-ante investments in port networks, transportation, buyer-seller links, investments to learn about the profitability of the trading relationship. And those investments have to be made ex-ante before the resolution of uncertainty. And in our model, those are going to provide a notion of resilience. That if there's very little uncertainty, I might allocate all my investments or a large share of my investments to trading with relatively few countries to benefit from the standard reasons for trade. Those countries are low-cost suppliers, and so I want to invest a lot with them. But on the other hand, if there's a lot of uncertainty, well, then I'm going to spread my investments across my trade partners. Not just for the usual love of variety reasons, but as a way of hedging uncertainty and as building in resilience to shocks. And then obviously in the background, there's going to be some resource constraint for my country that I've got a total supply of labor L bar, and I can either use that to produce my goods, or I can use it to invest in my bilateral import capacity with all the countries I'm sourcing goods from, and my bilateral export capacity to ship goods to other countries. And one of the nice things about the way we've built this model is despite these sort of new elements of resilience, import capacity, export capacity, if we shut down uncertainty, so if we assume the world is completely uncertain, then it turns out that our model is going to collapse down to a standard quantitative trade model, a standard international trade model. And that's because of the particular way we've modeled this resilience. We've modeled them as when I trade with countries, a constant share of that revenue is allocated to import capacity and export capacity. And that has the nice feature that everything collapses down to the standard trade model. But then as soon as we introduce uncertainty, we get these new effects. We get this idea that I want to hedge against risk when I'm thinking about who I trade with. Okay, so let's sort of think how this model would work. And I'm going to, as standard in economics and a lot of game theory, we're going to solve things backwards. So we're going to start at the end, and then we'll work back to the beginning. So I'm going to begin by supposing that I've already made these upfront investments in my logistic network, in who I trade with, my import and my export capacity, I for import capacity and H for export capacity. Then when I solve my model, it turns out that after I've made those investments, I can solve it in a very similar way to standard trade models. And so the entire equilibrium of the model is going to reduce to a very simple relationship, namely that each country's income has got to equal expenditure on the goods produced by that country. And that relationship is sort of summarized in this equation in the middle of the page. The key things that are determined in equilibrium are going to be the wages in different countries around the world. And these wages are going to be endogenous. And later on, the presence of uncertainty will affect those wages. At the moment, I'm just solving the model once all the uncertainty has been realized. But later on, there's going to be a distribution over these wages, which is determined endogenously. And we're going to show how to solve for that. But once those investments of import capacity have been determined, all the shocks are realized, then at that point I can just solve this equation and work out the wages. And as I said, the way I built the model, it looks very like a standard trade model. So what do these wages in each country depend on? Well, they depend upon countries' productivities, so Z. So the higher my productivity, the higher my wages in equilibrium. They also depend upon the exogenous component of trade costs, the taus. So if I have high trade costs to all other countries, that's going to reduce my wages in equilibrium, so they'll play a role. And they're also going to depend upon these endogenous components of trade costs, my investments in import capacity and export capacity. So by investing in import and export capacity, I can lower my trade costs with other countries, and I can reap the benefits of international trade. Okay. And then one or two other things come out of the model that although this equation looks very similar to a standard trade model, you'll see there's a key parameter in this equation, the omega tilde there. And that omega tilde is not just the standard preference parameter of a trade model, which is actually omega without the tilde, as you see towards the bottom of the slide. So that basically determines how substitutable countries' goods are. So why do I trade with other countries? Because their goods are imperfect substitutes for mine in various ways. But in our model, that imperfect substitutability gets modified by these upfront investments in resilience. And that delta parameter there controls the importance of those upfront investments in resilience. And so the presence of these investments transforms the trade elasticity, what's referred to the trade elasticity in this class of models. So that's how the ex post stage works once we've made our upfront investments in import and export capacity and all the shocks are realized. But obviously the key thing we're interested in is that the world's uncertain, and we want to know how do we make our upfront investments in import and export capacity before that uncertainty is realized. And what are the implications of the presence of this uncertainty for sourcing patterns? And so that's what we're going to characterize now. We're going to look at the ex ante equilibrium before these investments in import and export capacity have been made. And so because we've kept the model fairly stylized, we can actually get a lot of sharp results for the predictions of the model. So what are those results? Well, the total amount of resources each country allocates to import and export capacity, adding up across all of its trade partners, including itself, are actually just constant shares of its resources, so namely alpha and beta. So I allocate a constant share alpha of my labor to my import capacity and a constant share beta to my exporter capacity after I add up across all countries. And that's just because import and export capacity here are acting like non-traded services that facilitate trade between countries. And again, as I mentioned, that's a sort of nice feature of the model because it allows us to nest standard trade models. And then the second result I get in the bottom of the slide is for the bilateral investments in individual trade partners. And here's where we start to get some new results, and I'm going to tease them out on this slide and the subsequent slide. So if there were no uncertainty, so in the absence of uncertainty, these relative investments in import and export capacity with my individual trade partners will just depend upon my relative sales or the relative values of my imports with each of those trade partners. So in other words, in the absence of uncertainty, if a trade partner generates a lot more revenue for me because they're a low-cost supplier, I'll invest more in trading with that trade partner. In our model, those get modified because when I think about investing how much in import and export capacity with my trade partners, I not only care about I don't care about realized revenues, I care about expected revenues, taking an expectation, so that's what the capital E there is, I'm thinking about expected revenues. And furthermore, I have to weight those revenues by what economists call the stochastic discount factor, or essentially the marginal utility of income. So when I invest in these relationships with my trade partners, I'm thinking about expected revenues in all the possible states of the world, all of the possible idiosyncratic shock and aggregate shocks, such as China invading Taiwan or other shocks that might happen to any of my other trade partners. And in fact, if we drill down a little bit deeper, we can get some even sharper results. If we take a second order approximation around the equilibrium in the model, we can get this sort of very sort of stark characterization in the proposition here, which actually connects closely with core ideas in finance. So in particular, what can we show? Well, we can show that as a second order approximation, that importer N is going to invest more in import capacity with exporter I's goods. If those goods are cheap in expectation, that's the standard trade result I mentioned earlier, and that would be true even in the absence of uncertainty. If a country like China is a low-cost supplier, you want to invest more in trading with them because you're getting the goods cheaper from them in expectation. But now we get some new results. We're going to, as an importer, we're going to invest more in import capacity with exporter I if that exporter's goods tend to be cheap when our marginal utility is high. So in states of the world where our marginal utility is high. That's a valuable trade partner to us because their goods tend to be cheap when we really value trading with them. We also tend to invest more in import capacity with that exporting country in states of the world when we have high purchasing power, because then we can buy a lot of goods from them. So that also makes sense intuitively. And we invest more in trading with that country when their goods are cheap in states of the world where all of our other suppliers are very expensive. Because then that's a really valuable trade partner for us because they're a great hedge for us. Because those trade partners' goods tend to be cheap when everyone else's goods are really expensive. And then we get similar results on the exporter side for investments in export capacity. And so we get this sort of very, very intuitive characterization that international trade is a lot like a portfolio problem. You don't just invest in trading with other countries based on expected costs. You take account of how variable those countries' costs are, how uncertain is it whether those costs are going to be high or low, and you care about this idea of hedging. I really want to invest in trade partners that provide me with good hedges. So if China invades Taiwan, I want to have some other options there, and I want to have some other possibility to trade with other countries. And I want to invest more in trading with those other countries that are good hedges in the state of the world when China invades Taiwan. So that's sort of a nice kind of neat characterization. That's actually a pretty general characterization. It holds in a kind of fairly wide class of models. Most of what I show you today, when I get to the quantitative part of the model, I'll show you results in what economists call incomplete markets. So that's the case when I can't ensure at all about these events, such as China invading Taiwan. And so it's these investments in import and export capacity that provide my resilience. But in the paper, we also provide characterizations when we have complete markets. So in other words, there are other financial instruments I can use to insure against these risks. And in fact, the results in the proposition here, this sort of the characterization I'm showing on the slide here, are actually fairly similar under complete markets. It's just you need to replace the terms in wages by terms in expenditure that include all of the transfers that you achieve through the use of complete markets. But most of the quantitative results I'll show you later will be the case of incomplete markets. In the paper, a lot of the kind of meat of the contribution, then combining the results in this proposition here, that I'm solving this mean variance problem, that looks very simple, but what's the difficult thing about that mean variance problem? Well, if you look at all the terms on the slide, as I just mentioned, they include terms in expected wages. But figuring out what those distributions of wages and what their expectations are is actually very, very hard. Why? Because even if I know the distribution of shocks, the probability China invades Taiwan, the probability a country gets a negative productivity shock, that's not enough. I mean, it's hard to know those distributions, but let's suppose I did. That's not enough. Why? Because wages are influenced by those shocks through that relationship I showed earlier, that a country's income equals all nations' expenditure on its goods. So I have to be able to solve that equation in every state of the world and then take expectations across those whole distributions. And a lot of the meat in the paper is showing how to do that. Essentially, we show, again, you can take a second order Taylor series approximation around the equilibrium, and we provide a characterization of the distribution of endogenous wages in terms of the distribution of exogenous productivities. Again, building ideas from the finance literature. And then we provide some simulation evidence. Obviously, that's an approximation. We provide some simulation evidence that second order approximation actually performs extremely well in practice in the data. But I want to make sure I have some time to show you my results. So let me just sort of flag one further feature of the model that sort of comes out. One of the sort of interesting features of our model relative to standard trade models is that the aggregate gains from trade are now quite different. Why? Because I not only have the standard gains from trade in these trade models, because countries' goods are imperfect substitutes, that's the standard reason for the gains from trade. I now have a couple of new forces. What's one of those new forces? Well, the presence of uncertainty. So it's well known in international trade, in the presence of incomplete markets. When you open up to trade, in principle, your welfare can go down. Newbery and Stiglitz, 1971, if uncertainty is greater in the open economy than in the closed economy. Or even if welfare doesn't go down, you care about the variance of real income. And so when you think about the gains from trade, the second moments of the distribution matter of real income. If I'm risk averse, how uncertain is real income in the open economy relative to the uncertainty of real income in the closed economy? And so we now need to take into account those uncertainty effects when we think about the welfare effects of opening up to trade. And then in addition, even putting that to one side, we get this other nice nuance, which is that we get a kind of a new adjustment to standard measures of measuring the first order moment effects of international trade. So in this class of trade models, there's a well-known result called the ACR formula, which says that if you want to calculate the gains from trade from this imperfect substitutability force, you just need to look at a country's expenditure on itself in the open economy equilibrium. This is closely related to one of the formulas Matteo shared earlier. Because in the closed economy, I know you spend all your income on yourself because you've got nobody else to spend it on. So I know that expenditure share is 1. And if I know that expenditure share in the open economy, I can calculate the gains from trade. In our model, that's not quite true, even for those first order moments. Why? Because your trading technology is very different in the closed and the open economies. In the open economy, you know you can trade with all these countries and they can help you hedge risk. So you have a very different pattern of investments in import and export capacity with all of those nations. Whereas obviously in the closed economy, you only invest in import and export capacity with yourself because you can only trade with yourself. And so you get this sort of correction of the standard formula for the gains from trade in addition to the second moment effects. So how do we take this to the data? Well, we take it to very standard data as used by this sort of class of conventional quantitative trade models. We've got IMF direction of trade statistics, data on bilateral trade flows. We take country GDP, price indices, and populations from the global macro database. And we use some information on the ratio of gross output to value added when we take the model to the data. The way we calibrate the model at the moment is that we sort of take the observed bilateral trade data, we invert the model, and we back out implied productivities and trade costs from the model. That gives us a distribution of productivities and trade costs that we can draw shocks from and that we kind of use in quantifying the model. And we then calibrate the parameters of the model to try to be as standard as possible relative to existing quantitative trade models. And then obviously the new components of our model are these investments in import and export capacity. And the way we take the model to the data at the moment is we use differences between what's called short and long run trade elasticities in the literature. So what are those in our model? Well, the short run trade elasticity is ex post, after you've made your investments in import and export capacity. If there's a shock to trade costs, how much do you change your trade flows? And so we know what that short run trade elasticity is in the model. What's the long-run trade elasticity? Well, that's before you've made your investments in import and export capacity. If there's a shift in the distribution of trade costs and distribution of productivities, how would you change your relative investments? And so we essentially calibrate those two objects in the model to exactly match empirical estimates in the literature of short and long-run trade elasticities. And for the moment, just for the purposes of illustration today, we actually shut down export capacity and we allocate all of these endogenous investments to import capacity. But results are sort of pretty robust to changing that assumption and allowing for both import and export capacity when you take the model to the data. So when we look at global productivity distributions, we find there's a very strong global factor that explains the variance-covariance matrix of countries' productivities, and that's sort of well known in the open economy business cycle literature. So that global factor, the first principal component, explains about 40% of the variance of countries' productivities. The first five principal components explain around 80% of variance of countries' productivities. And so I'm flagging that because that's going to be sort of important in interpreting some of the results we get for hedging motives when countries engage in international trade. Now we've got a model where we can think about general equilibrium uncertainty. We can do some sort of new counterfactuals that you can't typically do in standard trade models. So what types of counterfactuals can we do? Well, I'll show you three in the remaining 8 minutes I have today. We'll show what happens if we change the correlation structure of productivities around the world. And for time reasons today, I'm mainly going to focus on productivities and the variance of productivities, their correlations. But in the paper, we report the full set of results for shocks to bilateral trade costs as well. So then in the first counterfactual, we're going to completely eliminate the correlation structure in the variance-covariance matrix that we see in the empirical distribution of productivities. Mm-hmm. So we'll set all the off-diagonal terms to zero. We'll remove the correlations in the variance-covariance matrix of country productivities, keeping the variance and the mean of productivities constant. What do we find? Well, in the top left panel, CE welfare, the panel labeled CE welfare, that's showing you the change in countries' welfare. So we find that some countries see increases in their welfare, other countries see reductions in their welfare when we eliminate that correlation structure. What's happening there? Well, welfare tends to go up in countries that load positively on that global factor for productivity that I just showed you to. Why? Because in the actual equilibrium, when countries are trading, their productivities are very correlated with one another. Countries that load positively on the global factor, they're countries that tend to be very strongly correlated with that common global factor for countries' productivities. And so in the initial equilibrium, international trade is not a very good hedge for those countries because all their productivities are very strongly correlated together. And so when we eliminate that correlation structure in the variance-covariance matrix, that raises welfare in those countries because now international trade is a better hedge than it was before. Conversely, countries in the actual world that load negatively on the global factor, for them international trade's a pretty good hedge because their productivities tend to be negatively correlated with other countries' productivities. And so when we eliminate the correlation structure in countries' productivities, trade is now a less good hedge, and so those countries' welfare goes down. And then in the final two panels of the graph, you can sort of show that for countries that correlate positively with the global factor, when we eliminate the correlation structure, trade is a less good hedge, so the welfare goes down, so the welfare goes up, and you can see there that the response to that is you invest more in trading with other countries and less in trading with yourself. So that's our sort of first counterfactual. We can think about eliminating the correlation structure, and welfare can either go up or down depending upon whether your productivity tends to be positively or negatively correlated with other countries, depending on whether trade is a good or bad hedge in the initial equilibrium. Now let's look at the second type of counterfactual we can perform with this framework. Well, we can also think about what happens if the world gets more uncertain. And so the next counterfactual we'll do is we're just going to double global uncertainty. So uncertainty goes up everywhere, including uncertainty with yourself, so including uncertainty about your own productivity. What do we see there? Well, we actually get a kind of a nuance here, which connects with some of the ideas we were discussing in the first session as well. In our framework, when countries think about trade, they're essentially trading off two things. On the one hand, there are some of the standard gains from trade. The country's goods are imperfect substitutes. But when I trade with other countries, I have to pay trade costs to trade with those other countries. It's costly to trade with other countries. Why do I do it? Well, because their goods are imperfect substitutes, and because I can hedge against risk when I trade with some of those other countries. In this world where I've just sort of doubled uncertainty, I've made the world a much more uncertain place. Those trade costs, the costs of trading with other countries, become less important relative to the uncertainty because I've made uncertainty larger in magnitude. And so what happens in our model? Well, now I actually want to trade more with other countries. And so when I double global uncertainty, in the left panel you see everyone's welfare goes down. That's not surprising because countries are risk averse and I've made the world more uncertain, so that's why welfare goes down. But now I want to trade more because in this uncertain world, trade is a better hedge for me. And so I invest less in trading with myself, I trade less with myself, and I trade more with other countries. Obviously that's sensitive to uncertainty going up everywhere. But it illustrates this sort of idea that trade is not always a bad thing when it comes to shocks, that it can actually provide a hedge. Obviously, there are issues about being dependent on critical suppliers, as Matteo highlighted, but also there are some positive aspects to trading with other nations if you can hedge risk. You may not want to put all your eggs in one basket, but by trading with a range, by investing in trading with a range of countries, you can hedge risks. And then what's the final counterfactual we can do with this framework? Well, we can think about questions such as, what happens if one country becomes much more uncertain? And so here we've considered the case where there's a mean-preserving spread in the US productivity distribution. So what happens if something in the United States changes so that the United States become a more uncertain country, productivity moves around, it becomes much more volatile. We can then start to think about how does that affect the welfare and the trade patterns of all other countries around the world. In the top left panel, we've got what happens to welfare in each country around the world. And what do we see? Well, we see that countries that have a positive covariance in their productivities with the US in the initial equilibrium, we see that their welfare goes down when the US becomes more uncertain. Why? Because those countries are tied together with the US, they're locked into the US. Trading with the US doesn't help them eliminate a lot of risk. And so when the US becomes more uncertain, it becomes an even worse hedge for them and their welfare goes down. In contrast, countries whose productivity tends to be negatively correlated with the US productivity, when I make the US more uncertain, it now becomes a better hedge trading with the United States because there's a negative covariance there. And so the US becoming more uncertain is helping those countries diversify risk. So welfare can either go up or down, again, depending upon the initial patterns of correlation in the variance-covariance matrix of countries' productivities. And then in response to that counterfactual, we see countries again making endogenous adjustments in their patterns of import and export capacity with all nations around the world. The main source of adjustment is either trading more or less with the United States as we make it more uncertain, depending upon whether you have a negative or a positive covariance with the United States. And the main adjustment is then changing how much you invest in trading with yourself. But we do see some effects on third countries, such as when the United States becomes more uncertain, some third countries start investing more in trading with China and starting to source a higher share of their goods from China, illustrating how the whole network matters in thinking about the impact of these shocks. So I think I'm down to my last minute, so let me sort of try to finish on the dime. What did we try to do in the paper today? Well, we tried to sort of take this class of constant illicit trade models that's very heavily used for quantitative analysis in international trade, for policy counterfactuals, such as, what are the effects of tariffs, what are the effects of other changes in policies that can happen in the global economy, We tried to go from a world where when countries source their goods, they know with certainty productivities in every nation around the world and trade costs with every nation around the world. And we've tried to introduce uncertainty into this class of models. And doing so is hard. Why? Because in general, those shocks affect the distribution of wages and prices in every country around the world. And so we tried to develop a tractable approach to building in that uncertainty that enables us to solve these models and to solve for, what are the distribution of countries' wages in every possible state of the world, and then think about international trade in that scenario. So we've done that to try to hit to these questions of uncertainty and resilience, rising geopolitical tensions, transportation disruptions in the aftermath of COVID. We've shown how to overcome that challenge of introducing uncertainty into these models, to allow countries to make these upfront investments in resilience, to enable them to try to hedge against that general equilibrium uncertainty. And what are the key payoffs that come out of the model? Well, a country's risk profile becomes a key object for thinking about comparative advantage and the gains from trade. And when countries open up, we need to think about those higher order moments and the role of uncertainty in influencing the welfare gains from trade and influencing patterns of trade. And if something in the world changes, such as the world becomes more uncertain, that's going to have rich general equilibrium implications for wages and welfare in countries around the world. And I should stop there to make sure that I finish on time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Mateo's got his card up. I'll let him go first, and I'm going to put mine up second, and then Brent.
First a remark and then two questions. The remark is, this is remarkable. It just really is a major improvement to bring in the portfolio models, just for everybody else to, in case this wasn't obvious. Everything I'd done in the first session is totally deterministic. And so it's totally missing concepts of, okay, what if there are shocks? What if there's uncertainty and I want to hedge against the possibility of a change in parity or that the tariff gets struck down? And this really gets you to do that. So it's totally non-trivial and a big step forward. I think it's going to have lots of uses. Now, on the uses, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on two particular things. First, a definition of dependency and resilience that takes into account those covariances, and one that hopefully we can bring to the data. Now, as a finance person, you guys have elasticities in trade that are your bête noire. We have those covariances. So I'm not that hopeful, but one can dream. The second part is, I'm wondering what the paper says about the value of doing nothing. In some sense, in my models, I always worry that as soon as you have budget, you spend it. There's always some activity that is optimal. But with uncertainty, you might think that the biggest strategic asset of the US is fiscal space. We don't know what's going to happen, and we want to do nothing and maintain lots of ability in the future to spend and hedge some shocks that might be geopolitical. How does that fit your model?
Thanks, Matteo. Great questions, both great points. On the dependence and resilience, it's actually sort of interesting. In this class of quantitative trade models we're building on, you can actually compute a sufficient statistic related to the sufficient statistics Matteo showed. But you can even sort of compute what's the elasticity of my real income in response to a shock in any other country around the world. And you can get a closed form solution for that in terms of the parameter, the trade elasticity, and the observed expenditure shares. And so Benny and Ernest and I have a paper called International Friends and Enemies where we sort of showcase that technology. Inside this model, you can compute something analogous. When you take that second order approximation around that equation that I showed on the slide for income equals expenditure, you get a kind of you can characterize what are the responsive moments of that distribution to the characteristics of moments of the exogenous productivity distribution, right? Up to a second order approximation. Right. So there's a limitation, but at least within that second order approximation, we can do something in terms of sort of deriving something like a sufficient statistic in terms of what is the effect of a particular set of shocks or a change in the distribution, a change in one country's variance on real income and distribution of real income for each country. And then on the point about doing nothing, I think that's actually a really, really good point and relates to debates about public debt sustainability in the United States. And as you sort of highlighted, when we cast things forward, US public debt looks sort of unsustainable on current trajectories without either a cut in expenditure or a change in taxation. But that's sort of implicitly often undertaken in a world of uncertainty. In a world of certainty, if we're in an uncertain world, are we going to be at war with a particular country? You might actually want to build in some fiscal space. In our model, the only way we allow resilience of these investments in import and export capacity, we haven't thought about allowing a kind of a general purpose savings technology like public savings to provide some sort of general contingency fund, and I think that would be really interesting to do. We have worked through the complete markets version of the model, which is sort of related to that, but we haven't worked through what you have in mind, which is some kind of intermediate case where you can sort of build a contingency fund which provides some sort of general insurance to shocks that's not import and export capacity. I need to think more about how to do that. I think that's a great idea, great suggestion.
Almost like a precautionary motive.
Yeah, precautionary saving. Yeah, that's a way to think about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to ask you to just be a little more concrete with at least one or two exercises. And you talked about the cost, the distribution across countries of the cost of greater uncertainty in the United States. So could you name names? Who's relatively hurt and benefited from more uncertainty? And this is about uncertainty about productivity in the United States, as everything went quickly, or is it about trade costs and trade export and import capacity in the United States?
Yep, sure. Happy to speak more to that. Great question again. So the results I'm showing here for an increase in the variance of U.S. productivity, as you pointed out, we could also do it for trade costs. The thing that's sort of richer with trade costs is they're obviously bilateral.
Yeah.
So when you change those, you have to sort of think about exactly how am I going to change the bilateral pattern of trade costs. But we can do all of those exercises inside of the model. For productivity, countries that tend to have very strongly correlated productivity with this global factor, well, the US is obviously very strongly correlated with that global factor. So are Western European countries like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Canada is also very highly correlated with that. And so all of those countries are going to tend to lose by the US becoming more uncertain. Countries that tend to have negative covariances with the United States, my eyesight's not good enough to read all of the three-letter codes up there, but it's often countries like Kuwait.
The first point is we're hurting our traditional allies and trading partners disproportionately more by extra uncertainty.
Yes, exactly. And it tends to be sort of resource-rich, lower-income countries that tend to have very strong negative covariances with the global factor and with the United States.
Okay. All right. So I've got Brent Nyman is next on the list here.
Thanks. I thought this was fantastic and actually a really great compliment to the first section. I had two quick questions. One kind of along the lines of Steve's, if you could be a little more concrete on what you think or how you'd want us to think of these country investments to be, and relatedly, how that relates to the role of the government. Sometimes you would speak or set up the model where it wasn't clear this wasn't fully internalized by firms. And the tools I have in mind would be a firm setting up a relationship with a distributor, let's say. But then other times, maybe you could imagine that that's not, the only thing is the country level trying to invest in minimizing policy risk via, better foreign relations or something. So if you could talk about that. And then the last thing is really closely related to Steve's is how much damage would your model do under a realistic calibration of uncertainty to our conventional notion of bilateral trade patterns? If you take your model and you collapse uncertainty to zero, are we talking massive changes, or is it basically we're on the original regression line and there's little squiggles here and there?
Cool. Thanks again, Brian. Both great questions as well. So the way we've sort of set the model up, turning first with the first question about the role of government. The way we've set the model up, we've kind of built it in a way that the representative consumer in each country owns all the firms and owns, in particular, has shares in firms, not just in the production sector, but also in the import and export capacity sectors. And so the way we've set things up, the model is efficient at the world level in the sense that a world planner, if we thought about a world planner, they would make exactly the same, investments that would occur as in a free trade equilibrium, a decentralized market equilibrium, perfectly competitive market equilibrium. A couple of caveats to that, firstly, that obviously at the national level, that's not quite true because they're going to be the standard terms of trade effects. And so, second caveat, that point about efficiency at the world level, obviously in the version of the model with incomplete markets, things are not efficient because we have incomplete markets. And so, the ratio of marginal utilities is not equalized across countries. And so one of the things that's sort of interesting in that incomplete markets version of the model is things like trade agreements can play a role in helping countries insure against risk. And so you have this sort of potential alternative way of thinking about trade agreements in addition to the kind of standard terms of trade effects, which are also present in the model. And so to that extent, we have some way of thinking about market failure at the national level to really grapple with some of the questions you raise, which is sort of the gap between the government and firms. Do firms internalize all of these risks? The way we've built the model, we've got this represented consumer who kind of internalizes everything that's happening to the firms. We've kind of done that to try to stay as close as possible to the standard trade models. But when we get to the policy debate, I kind of agree with you. It's kind of good to think about what are the reasons why the government may not think in exactly the same way as a kind of representative agent in the firm. So I think that's a really, really good point. We have some ways of thinking about market failures in the existing model, but I think you're kind of pointing towards other really interesting points there. On your second point about the welfare costs, the first thing there to say is that, we wouldn't want to claim this is going to be kind of huge for the kind of usual reasons that, second order terms, often a lot of the sort of magnitudes are for the first order terms rather than the second order terms. So, the numbers we're coming up in the quantitative exercises, they're non-trivial, but they're not huge. We kind of know the standard gains from trade are not huge. So, Arkalakis, Costner, Rodriguez-Clare, their standard numbers are for the US are sort of 2 to 8% of GDP, which is it's not trivial, but it's not a huge number. The second moment effects we're getting are kind of economically relevant. One of the things that's sort of interesting, as I kind of briefly flagged, is in our model, the welfare effects of uncertainty not only come through the second order terms, they also come through the first order term. Because uncertainty skews how much you invest in trading with other countries than with yourself. And so that's one kind of channel we can get which kind of magnifies the effect of uncertainty in our framework. And I kind of agree with you that it would be really interesting to do the sort of exercise you suggested, which is, when you ramp up uncertainty or when you ramp down uncertainty, by how much do you skew trade patterns and how big are the welfare effects relative to the standard model? And I agree with you, we should do more on that. But it's kind of an interesting feature of the framework that uncertainty doesn't just matter through the second order terms, it also matters through the first order terms. Yeah, great questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jinji Shu. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but you're up next.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Jency, good.
Super cool paper. I wanted to ask a little bit about, so the negative correlations, that makes a lot of sense, how that brings about insurance. But it also seems to me that even when countries are positively co-varying, as long as there's differences in their volatility, you still have this benefit from trade just through pure terms of trade effects of like, we're both doing poorly, but I'm doing even more poorly. And so I have this insurance from that. And that seems like it's actually, there's more to trade integration than just literally we want to think about more trade with our obvious insurers.
Yep. Great question. Great point. Absolutely right. When you trade with other countries, there are those other forces in the model, one way of thinking about it, but there are other ways, is that sort of countries' goods are imperfect substitutes, or there's sort of a love of variety effect. Do you want to, even in the absence of uncertainty, you would trade with a range of countries because the sort of, the way we literally model it is love of variety, but you could also model it as Ricardian technology differences, or love of variety in a Krugman style model when firms make differentiated products. All of those would create that force. And so you're absolutely right, and actually it's an interesting feature of the model. That sometimes in finance, when we take the limit, as we take the limit as uncertainty goes to zero, portfolios don't become well-defined. In our model, even as you take that limit, the portfolios actually stay well-defined because there's this other reason for diversifying, which is that you've got this love of variety. And then when you increase uncertainty, that uncertainty will skew your trading patterns based on this hedging motive. And so that's important, but you're right to kind of point out that there is that other force for trade. And actually it's something that makes the problem very tractable. The sort of, essentially we have some curvature that you often don't have in finance models from this love of variety. And that's what keeps things very kind of tractable and lets us handle this sort of multi-country GE setup. So yeah, that's a great question and great thing to point out.
Thanks. Emily Blanchard.
Thank you. This was really, really good, great, interesting. And now I'm going to give you a hard time.
Yeah, that's good. Hard time is good.
So one thing, I think it's closely related to Chen Zi's question. As I looked at the outliers on a bunch of those plots in terms of which countries, naming names, which countries are more or less hurt by some of these thought experiments and the counterfactuals, I noticed there were a lot of oil exporters. And that could be negative correlation, but it could also be a feature of the fact that your quantitative model has the Armington assumptions built in. It's got CES, this very strong log of variety, and then you've got these countries that for other reasons are highly, highly concentrated. I mean, Angola was sitting there in a corner, I think, twice. And so I looked at that and said, ooh, in what way are the usual tractability assumptions that we use, like CES, like our nesting structures, biasing the qualitative implications of what you're finding, and particularly the ranking of the countries that are more or less hurt in different counterfactuals. And then related to that, again, just one other question around where maybe are the quantitative results showing us things that aren't quite going to line up. I was wondering, you're using these Taylor series expansions, which tells me we have very sharply defined model behavior around marginal changes. But most of these thought experiments are black swan events of extremely large changes in the global economy, a systemic shock to many places all at once in a very big way. So just, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to use this and interpret the calibration with care.
Great questions, both really good points. So let me respond to those. Absolutely, the way we've kind of set up the paper is we're really trying to speak to this standard class of quantitative trade models, and as you're sort of highlighting, that class does make some stylized assumptions, such as a single sector and so on. It's quite a big class of models, but there are stylized assumptions. We've kind of chosen to focus on that case partly for this sort of pedagogical tool that we want to kind of show how you can put uncertainty in this influential class of models. But we have, related to your question, we have kind of looked at extensions. So one of the extensions that's very easy to work out is a multi-industry version of the model. And so we have that in the paper. So if instead of a single sector, you have multiple industries. And so then, when you think about the productivity distribution, it's now country industry. And so, the variance covariance structure is much richer there, and you have industry comparative advantage. All of that stays tractable, and you can use all of these techniques to go through the sort of multi-industry setup. In principle, I think we could even handle multi-industry input-output structure if it took the so-called Caliendo-Paro form or the kind of Cobb-Douglas input-output structure. I think that's kind of doable within the framework, and we could do more in the quantitative exercises to kind of show how much does the multi-industry structure change some of these results. So that's a great question. In terms of the expansion, so one of the things we've done is, the nice thing about the second order Taylor series approximation is it gives us these analytical results. We can say, like, how does uncertainty change who you want to source from, because you've got the hedging motive. And we get this sort of very clear expression for how variances and covariances matter. You're right that only holds up to a second order approximation. So one of the things we've done is we've sort of created Monte Carlo simulations where we draw random productivities from the distribution of productivity and random trade costs, and then simulate the general equilibrium, solve for you can only do that numerically but you can certainly do it numerically. So for every set of draws, you can solve the model numerically, and that gives you a distribution of wages, and then you can repeat that 1,000 times, and you have 1,000 of these distributions. And what we found is that at least, if we assume that productivity is log normally distributed, the second order Taylor series expansion is very good to the full nonlinear model solution. That the predictions of the model, both on the first and second moments, align very closely to the first and second moments of the numerical simulation. So that works quite well. That's actually related to some other results in finance that a country's income equals expenditure on its goods. That equation actually involves taking you can write it as taking a weighted sum of logs. On the left-hand side, there's a log wages, depends upon the log of a weighted sum of wages. And there's some results in the finance literature, Campbell-Vacera and other related results. Again, some of those results use second-order approximation, but they sort of show with a log normal distribution that if the distribution of productivities is log normal, that weighted sum of log normals stays log normal up to that second order approximation. And again, that's something that comes out of the numerical simulation, that if we use log normal productivities, that distribution of wages is approximately log normal. So at least for the exercises we've done so far, this approximation seems to sort of be characterized in the numerical simulation pretty accurately.
Okay, Jim Fearon.
Not a trade economist, but seems like super impressive to me and like a very basic contribution. It seems like from what my political theory friends call it, it's in the realm of what they call ideal theory, and that it's, what would ideally be best. I wanted to ask maybe an unfair question about that. The insight that, in the face of increasing uncertainty, trade may actually be, you may want to do more of it to diversify. That's great. It's interesting also because it goes against the kind of instinct politically and in parts of my IR, IPE fields that, you'd actually want to protect yourself by doing less trade. What do you make of, in the last 15, 20 years, the US political class has turned really hard against trade and trade deals. The Biden administration, if you look at their economic strategy documents, they pointedly avoid even the word trade, and certainly trade deals. You saw this in the 2016 election with kind of both parties going against TPP. The Republicans even more dramatically going in the opposite direction of their traditional position. And one of the puzzling things here is, as near as I can tell, and it's not, I don't focus on this much, but the public opinion polls, it's not like public opinion has turned hard against trade. In fact, if anything, it's been seems, especially under Trump, more favorable, both in his first term and now. So I don't know, maybe it's not being measured well, or maybe they're targeting some median voter who's really anti-trade. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like rising uncertainty is leading us to say hey, let's do more trade.
Yeah, no, important question. I think it relates to actually one of Maury's questions during Matteo's talk, that I think that shift against trade in the political consensus, both Democrats and Republicans, I think is very closely related to the distributional consequences of international trade, but not just trade, the distributional consequences of technology. So in particular, obviously, one of the big phenomena, I'm not a political scientist, so you tell me I might get this completely wrong, but one of the kind of big features of the shift in the US political environment is the loss of a lot of blue-collar worker support by the Democratic Party, and the shift towards the Republican Party, and in particular towards the MAGA strand of the Republican Party. And so one view of the Trump administration's policies would be that it's partly that the tariffs and the protection is partly playing to that part of the political base, to that populist part of the political base, and that the Biden-Harris administration was very nervous about walking those tariffs back for the fear that they would lose more of that traditional blue-collar working-class support to the Republican Party. And so that would be my personal take on the political consensus, would be it's not really about the aggregate gains from trade, it's about distributional consequences, and in particular a segment of the political electorate, this sort of traditionally Democrat voting, blue-collar working class that have switched allegiance, and a related phenomena of sort of factory towns, declining regions.
So we'd expect to find in that kind of median area a lot of opposition to trade.
Correct, and we don't really fully have that in the model because we have a representative agent. And so traditional trade models that have those distributional consequences, they still have the aggregate gains. It's just that you have winners and losers. And they're the kind of two classic insights from international economics, is that you have aggregate gains, trade is win-win, but then you have winners and losers within countries. And so I think we could, in principle, build that into this model, build in those distributional consequences. As you highlighted with the first part of your question, the reason we've kind of abstracted from them is we want to take the basic trade model, which emphasizes that trade is win-win. But I think to fully engage with your questions, one really needs to do the distributional side of that. But I think there is part of your question that even within our framework, with a single agent, a representative agent, we could do more to address this point about, is trade always good in a more uncertain world? And I think the reason to do that, the way to do that, it would overlap a little bit with Emily's points, is to bring in multiple industries in output linkages. And then you might not want to be dependent on Taiwan in an uncertain world. And in fact, the very fact the world's uncertain means you really don't want to be dependent on Taiwan. And so putting uncertainty into the model is crucial to thinking about that. But maybe you might want to diversify more by trading with Canada or your other allies. That would be one type of insight that would come out of our model, that you might want to sort of diversify with a group of other countries. But you may not want to put yourself at risk for individual sort of critical components. And we could do more in the model with a multi-industry structure to kind of speak to that side of the debate. But yeah, great points.
Okay, we have 3 more people in 6 minutes. So Chad Bone, you're next.
Super interesting, Steve. I wanted to, and those Biden people were absolutely crazy. So just wanted to second that. I want you to write your next paper, which is on trade agreements. So stick in this and help us. And since you haven't written it yet, maybe you can give us some intuition. Are there counterintuitive things that if you stick this model into kind of a trade agreements framework would come up? Suddenly lowering tariffs between two countries could create problems in counterintuitive ways. Are there optimal countries that should be getting together and having trade agreements? Are there institutional design questions that we've been struggling to pin down and understand that all of a sudden make sense if we have this as the underlying model, like exceptions and safeguards and things of that nature? When countries come together, if they're not the right natural partners, do they need to also adopt some domestic policies to counteract some of the insurance? So just is there anything that comes to mind in terms of intuition there?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So I'll conjecture a little bit. It's a little bit speculative because we haven't really sort of dipped our toes into the water, and none of the co-authors are experts in trade policy. So I should be picking Kyle's brains on this, and your brains on this, and Emily's brains on this. One of the things I think is kind of really interesting in our framework. So we have the standard motive for thinking about trade agreements in our model. So as many of you know, that's the sort of so-called terms of trade externality, that an individual country has a particularly large country that is able to influence its terms of trade, relative prices with other countries it's trading with, has an incentive to introduce at least a small tariff to improve its terms of trade. And the standard theory of trade agreements is that one rationale for something like the World Trade Organization is that it enables large countries to escape a prisoner's dilemma where they all introduce tariffs to try to improve their terms of trade. But then because they all introduce the tariffs, they actually don't get any benefit, any improvement in the terms of trade. They just distort consumption production decisions, and so actually end up being worse off than if they could somehow commit not to use tariffs. So that sort of features in our model. Because we have incomplete markets and we have risks, we have a new way of thinking about trade agreements, which is that potentially in this world with tariffs, I might want to sign a trade agreement with a particular set of bilateral partners, because by manipulating the tariff levels, I can help insure myself against risks. So I'm not really far enough along to kind of give you a very clear statement about where are the intuitions and surprises we get from that insight relative to the standard terms of trade story. But one area I could speculate with is that the standard argument for trade agreements, as emphasized in Kyle and Bob Steger's fundamental contributions, is that if you start with a kind of Nash equilibrium where we're in this sort of trade war where we all introduce tariffs, and then we come together and we bargain under the rules of the World Trade Organization of reciprocity and non-discrimination, that can at least move us towards the efficiency frontier. And a key feature of that is the so-called MFN, most favored nature principle of sort of reciprocity. It's at least not obvious to us that reciprocity would always work in the same way in this setting of incomplete markets, because I might actually want to be non-reciprocal, precisely because I'm using the trade agreement to help me insure against risk. And so while that's a little speculative, that would be one area where I think actually this way of thinking about things could actually yield quite different predictions that it might in principle affect that sometimes you might want to depart from reciprocity.
Thank you. Matilda Bombardini.
Great, super interesting. I was just thinking, and you mentioned sort of social planner, and that's kind of along the lines of Chad's question, but this is more on the infrastructure building. So is there some kind of triangular inequality that's kind of broken by these shocks, and that you can do you have underinvestment or overinvestment? If I think that, France diversifies, but it's optimal for Germany not to diversify because it's sitting right next to it. And so if France makes the investment, Germany doesn't want to make the investment. And so is there like some suboptimal or, too much investment, too little investment? And so I wasn't clear enough on the structure on the model to see where that fits or doesn't fit. So, yeah.
Yep. Great question. So in some models you could write down, definitely you could think about models that would have that feature. Actually, the way we write down the model, there isn't that feature in the sense that that's not a source of underinvestment. So what would the intuition be for that? That the externality is going through market prices, and so it's actually not distorting the market equilibrium. Right. So for example, with say labor and capital in the production technology, they affect one another's marginal products, but under perfect competition it wouldn't be inefficient, even though there's that sort of externality because it's moving through market prices. Right. And the way we've set up these investments in import and export capacity, that's true here as well. Mm-hmm. And so that's why there's not that source of inefficiency. And so the only sources are firstly incompleteness of financial markets, and then secondly, the sort of terms of trade externality
Right.
between countries. But related to some of the other questions, you might want to think about other ways of modeling things. So what if you had oligopolistic power in the transportation sector? And then you could sort of think that there might be strategic, underinvestment in those sectors in a world where we're competing under oligopoly. So it's going to depend a lot on whether our investments are strategic complements or
Yeah,
strategic
exactly. Yeah,
substitutes and so on. But yeah, I agree that would also be really interesting to think about. Again, we kind of built things in the way we did, partly to stay in this kind of
simpler
classic
and
standard benchmark trade models. But I agree there are lots of other interesting questions there.
Thank you. And Peter, you get to bring us home again.
I'll be quick because I'm between us and lunch. In the spirit of Jim Farron's question, my question is, can you take this to the data and take that seriously? So I think you get some testable predictions, even in a U.S. context, because you've got this setup where you have, for instance, everyone in the economy implicitly holding shares in all the corporations, right? And so in areas like the blue collar areas you talked about, you'd have a departure from that. But I'm more interested actually in thinking about the other countries, right? And have you asked the question, do we see more investment? I mean, it also depends on how you think about these shocks, right? So if you identify, what kinds of productivity shocks do you have in mind? Are there episodes that you have in mind where there are large U.S. productivity shocks? And have you thought about then actually looking at the countries that your model predicts would have the biggest kind of investment response in relation to that and so on? I think you could do something with that potentially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great suggestion. We can definitely do more with the quantitative analysis. We can definitely, the model connects directly to the data. And that's one of the advantages of working with this class of models is they're kind of built to connect with the data, and we're putting uncertainty into that framework. So one of the ideas we had in mind is something like China invades Taiwan. And so how would you think about that in the model? That actually ends up in the model showing a lot like a negative productivity shock in Taiwan, in that, semiconductor production, all sorts of production gets disrupted in Taiwan. Some of that shock might be uneven across trade partners, but a lot of it might be just like a productivity shock in Taiwan. And so we could, inside the model, we can say who would be worse affected by that. And as the probability that China invades Taiwan goes up, how should countries change their investments in import and export capacity? So that's the type of exercise we could do more on. And related to Emily's question, when you build in multiple industries and input-output linkages, then you can start to think about, well, what if there's uncertainty in the semiconductor industry? Or what are the sectors where this uncertainty really matters and where we really want to hedge risk? And so that's another area where we could do a little bit more with the quantitative analysis.
And small countries may give you more purchase there, right? Because they're
very dependent.
These shocks.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're shocks, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
But great theoretical accomplishment in getting this done. It's not easy work.
Great suggestions and really helpful suggestions. Very, very much appreciated.
Okay, thanks so much. That was another stimulating presentation and discussion. We have lunch now. Lunch is behind me, and you can just bring it back to your chair and have it here. And we will resume sharply at 1 with a panel session on the future of international institutions.